What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony, let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody, I hope you're all having a lovely end to the week and a relaxing weekend. China continues to grapple with its months-long Evergrande crisis. Now, when we say the Evergrande housing crisis, of course, this is just a useful shorthand for the wider property crisis in the Chinese economy. Because after all, this structural and systemic challenge is much bigger than a few heavily over-leveraged mega developers. China's property challenge, its bubble housing market, its debt-ridden, over-leveraged development sector, is something that top officials understand and want to fix, but there are deep systemic barriers that prevent this from happening. We got a taste of this in Friday's video yesterday when we saw how hard it was for Beijing just to roll out the extension of a property tax pilot. Now, one of these principal systemic barriers that we're talking about is the key role that land sales, by which we mean the sale of land use rights, play in local government revenue, and thus the wider constitutional structure surrounding the fiscal revenue and spending obligations for local governments in relation to the central government. This week, several excellent reports have been published on these themes, including from Caixin, so it's a good opportunity, I think, to examine once again the relationship between local government land sales and the Evergrande housing crisis. Analysts with Caixin point out that with the rapid development of China's real estate market, the revenue from land sales has grown rapidly. In the last 20 years, land sales revenue has been an important source of fiscal revenue for local governments. In 2009, the national revenue from land sales was approximately 1.4 trillion RMB, $219.9 billion US dollars, equivalent to about 4.1% of GDP at that time. By 2021, the figure had almost doubled to 8.7 trillion RMB, equivalent to 7.6% of GDP. Now, they provide a very useful graph here, which I have up for you guys. They go on to explain that demand for land has been strong in eastern provinces, no surprise there, due to the constant inflow of migrants from other parts of the country and the red-hot real estate sector. East China's Jiangsu province has been among the top 4 since 1998 and has dominated the list since 2008. Neighboring Zhejiang province, driven by a robust technology sector, you see players like Alibaba and others there, has been in second place since 2016. Now, most sensible commentators argue that land sales revenue in the early years of development, the 90s and the first few years of the first decade of the 21st century, on balance was positive for economic growth and played a good supporting role for local government revenue, which was reinvested into the local economy through much needed infrastructure. However, corruption and abuse of weak rural households was always an issue. And then, as the real estate industry started to balloon up and productivity rates from infrastructure investment began to decline, deep systemic issues manifested themselves, namely state-backed bubble prices for land and, by extension, homes, government debt, and unbridled fiscal spending. Now, this brings us to the next point as well, the role of local government incentives. Quote, "Some say the root cause lies in the reform of the real estate industry and housing market, and the tax-sharing system. But I think the key to the problem is the local government's performance appraisal mechanism, which triggers a chain reaction that incentivizes the accumulation of hidden debt. Even without the tax-sharing system, as long as the local government's performance evaluation is GDP-focused, there will still be a thirst for funds." End quote. I tend to agree. Luo Zhiheng also makes several other key points. Public ownership of land and the paid use system in China is the foundation for land sales revenue. In 1998, a new law officially established the paid use system for state-owned land, followed by the system of auction and listing in 2004, by which time the market system for land use rights was established. The reform of the land sales management system in the early 2000s contributed to the standardization of land sales revenue as a fiscal means for local governments. And in 2015, the new budget law formally incorporated government fund budgets into the central government budget system, and the budgeting and collection of land sales revenues were monitored by the National People's Congress. That is the situation we have today. Quote, but behind all these, the performance appraisal mechanism is the key to solving the problem created by the GDP-focused mindset where land sales revenue is favored by local governments as a way to solve the twin problems of attracting investment and boosting GDP. What's more, during the period of rapid economic growth in China, the GDP-based performance assessment was conducted by motivating local governments to develop the economy by any means necessary, even at the cost of damaging the environment or creating hidden debts. End quote. So we can see that local government reliance on land sales as a revenue source combined with the incentives which spring from the growth-focused appraisal mechanisms for local officials act as iron forces behind the massive debt accumulation and bubble prices in the property sector, which in turn underpin the large property sector crisis China has been experiencing and which we have been following over the last several months. The painful but much needed change the property sector must go through can only be achieved if these structural constraints are dealt with. But that is much easier said than done. Hey guys, if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to hit the like button. It's a huge help. I try to release one of these every day, or at least 5 or 6 days out of the week. If you're watching for the first time and you're getting some value from the content, maybe consider subscribing, and you'll have the most up-to-date analysis on China when these are released. Now, just quickly, before we move on to the Ukraine war and what it means for China, let's touch on this first, the Biden-Xi phone call, because it is important to touch on. Even though we don't have too much substance from the call, we need to discuss it quickly. 2 weeks ago, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke to US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Then at the start of this week, Yang Jiechi, who's higher than Wang Yi, and Jake Sullivan, a national security advisor to the Biden administration, White House, had an 8-hour meeting in Rome to discuss a whole range of issues, including Ukraine. Unfortunately, we didn't learn too much about what was discussed outside of what was listed on the dry meeting readouts from both sides. But then on Friday, yesterday, General Secretary Xi Jinping and US President Joe Biden spoke for about 2 hours in a virtual meeting. Official statements said that the meeting was to discuss the war in Ukraine. The Chinese position was that Beijing wishes to support peace negotiations, with Xi expressing, quote, as permanent members of the UN Security Council and the world's 2 largest economies, we must not only lead the development of China-US relations on the right track, but also shoulder our due international responsibilities and make efforts for world peace and tranquility, end quote. While the White House stressed that there would be consequences if Beijing provides support to Russia. According to a senior US official speaking about the meeting with reporters after the meeting, Biden also warned against, quote, disinformation about biological weapons in Ukraine as a pretext for a false flag operation, end quote. Along with Ukraine, other issues in the relationship were discussed, including Taiwan. Chinese state media described the meeting as quote-unquote constructive. Now, while the exchange between the 2 leaders was no doubt very civil, it is unlikely to have any effect on the relationship, and indeed the general relationship can be described as deeply toxic and adversarial. The Sino-American bilateral relationship is at its worst point in decades, probably not this bad since the Mao era, although I guess it is a good sign that the leaders can at least speak to one another. Okay, last up, China's Ukraine dilemma. Now, we've already done a few deep dives into the nature of China's dilemma with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So for the end of today's video, I just wanted to touch on a few miscellaneous things which touch on different aspects of this foreign policy challenge for China. First, and this is interesting, according to a survey released on Tuesday of this week by the Taipei-based Taiwan International Strategic Studies Society, the invasion of Ukraine looks to have made more people in Taiwan in favor of an overhaul of reservist training and extending mandatory military service. The institute surveyed 1,076 people last month and found that 70.2% were willing to go to war to defend Taiwan in the event of an attack from the mainland. This is a massive jump from the same survey that was taken in late December, when this number was only 40.3% of respondents. Second, the Ukraine war has thrown a wrench into China's foreign policy objectives with the EU. China had hoped, perhaps overly optimistically, to pull the EU away from the US and closer to the People's Republic of China so as to better compete with the United States. One former German diplomat in China and senior research fellow at the German Studies Center at Tongji University in Shanghai expressed in a report this week, quote, "It's not in the Chinese interest to have the EU and the United States get too close together. And the longer this war lasts, the closer the EU and the US will move. I don't think that's in China's interest, and the Europeans know that." And one other point to touch on before we end the video, China's relationship with Russia and the political issues this causes for Xi Jinping. Former national security official Evan Medeiros this week discussed the Russian dilemma from the position of Xi Jinping and his power base. Quote, "Altering the course of China-Russian relations is probably a political liability for Xi Jinping in such a sensitive year. Xi Jinping faces a potentially very challenging choice. If Xi admits that his policy towards Russia has been wrong, he opens himself up to criticism within the party. If he doesn't, he risks tying China's fate to a mired invasion, the killing of civilians, and whatever moves Russian President Vladimir Putin might take if cornered. A third option, continuing to sit on the fence, becomes increasingly difficult given the breadth of global outrage." End quote. Despite this, all signals from both diplomatic actors as well as state media suggest that China wants to continue the strategy of trying to sit on the fence without alienating its relationship with Russia or with Europeans, and for that matter, many others in the general international community. Hey guys, I'd love to hear what you thought about some of the updates we covered in today's episode, so throw your comments below. Always love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.